Go, go. You're supposed to be dead on the spot, but she knows. I tracked the ammunition as runs. Old claim will settle into terms of absolute secrecy. Until it goes down, the stern
The first thing Titanic gives us is not the ship, not the lovers, not even the promise of disaster. It gives us blue, a deep, submerged blue broken by drifting particles and the pale beam of a machine searching through darkness. Matter rests below like a memory that has forgotten how to speak. The ocean pulses against every surface, and before the film asks us to look back, it reminds us that the past is not gone. It is simply lying somewhere beneath us, waiting for light. This is the Cineflaps, and if you are here, you probably already know that cinema is never only what happens on screen. It is the temperature of a room after the final image disappears. It is the rhythm that stays in your body. It is the strange way a color, a face, or a piece of music can return years later with more meaning than it carried the first time. Some films entertain us and leave. Others sink slowly into memory. Titanic does both. James Cameron's 1997 epic is often remembered through scale, the enormous ship, the enormous production, the enormous success, the crowds, the awards, the songs, the images that became part of global culture. But size alone does not explain why this film endured. Spectacle can impress us for an evening. Titanic has lasted for decades because beneath the spectacle is something intimate and almost painfully simple. Two people meeting inside a world that has already decided who they are allowed to become. That is where I want us to stay for a while, not only with the sinking, because history has already told us how that ends, not only with the romance, because the romance is more complicated than the shorthand of posters and parodies. I want us to sit with the distance between the surface and the depths, between the glittering decks above and the black water below, between the identities people perform and the selves they keep hidden, between the life Rose has been instructed to live and the light that begins to flicker in front of her when Jack looks at her as though she is not an ornament, not a daughter, not a future wife, but a person still becoming. The blue of this film changes as we move through it. At first, it is archaeological, cold, distant, almost clinical. It belongs to cameras, floodlights, rusted corridors, and people trying to recover objects from a grave. Then it becomes romantic. The twilight around the ship, the air at the bow, the open heaven that seems to offer escape without asking for permission. Later, the same blue turns merciless. It becomes the color of exposure, silence, and time running out. And by the end, it becomes memory itself, beautiful, unreachable, and still alive in the person who carries it. That transformation is what this essay will follow. Because Titanic is not merely a love story placed inside a catastrophe, it is a film about the human need to feel alive before the world closes in. It understands that freedom does not always arrive as a grand victory. Sometimes it arrives as a conversation with a stranger, a drawing, a dance below deck, a hand extended across a social boundary. A moment when someone sees the panic behind your composure and refuses to look away, and yet the film also understands that personal awakening does not stop history. The ship continues forward. The engines continue turning. The people with power continue believing that the rules protecting them are permanent. This is one of the film's deepest tensions. An individual can change in an instant, but the structures surrounding that person may remain terrifyingly fixed. Think about what that means. Rose can discover another version of herself, but the ocean does not care. Jack can give her a language for freedom, but class still determines who reaches the boats first. Love can make two people feel as though the world has opened, even while the physical world around them is narrowing corridor by corridor. Cameron keeps placing emotional expansion beside material confinement. The more alive they become, the less space they have. The film breathes outward as the ship closes inward. Cinema rarely does this with such directness and such confidence. It makes the personal and the historical move through the same frame. A glance can matter as much as a collapsing structure. A quiet promise can stand beside thousands of lives in danger without making either feel small. The film can be broad, sentimental, even unabashedly theatrical, and still find moments of startling precision. A mother preparing her children for sleep because she has nothing else left to offer them. An elderly couple choosing closeness over panic. Musicians continuing to play as order dissolves. None of these moments require long explanations. Their power comes from the way the film pauses and lets human behavior speak. Here's what I keep returning to. Titanic knows that tragedy is not only moment something is lost. Tragedy begins earlier, and everything people assume will remain: the untouched glass, the polished silver, the rigid etiquette, the schedules, the locked gates, the confident claims that a structure this impressive cannot fail. The film spends so much time showing us surfaces because it wants us to understand how fragile surfaces are. And perhaps that is why the opening search through the wreck matters so much. We begin after certainty has already collapsed. We know the ship is gone. We know the luxury has decayed. We know the people who once filled those rooms had become names, photographs, fragments, and stories told by others. The film does not create suspense by hiding the outcome. It creates feeling by asking us to care anyway. That may be Titanic's most generous invitation. Care even when you know. Love even when time is limited. Look closely even when the image will disappear. So, before we step aboard, before the music rises, before the ship becomes a moving city of ambition and separation, we need to understand the world that wanted a film like this, the cinema that made room for it, and the cultural moment in which an old disaster returned as a new global myth. To understand why that invitation struck so deeply, we have to return to 1997, a moment when Hollywood was becoming increasingly fluent in the language of scale. Digital effects were no longer a novelty glimpsed at the edge of a frame. They were beginning to reshape what a mainstream film could show, how far a camera could appear to travel, and how completely a lost world could be rebuilt. The blockbuster had learned how to promise the impossible, but Titanic arrived with a different kind of impossibility. It was not asking technology to imagine the future. It was asking technology to resurrect the past. Every corridor, plate, rivet, and deck had to feel like a place history had briefly returned to us. The film's ambition was therefore strangely divided. It wanted to be the most modern kind of cinematic event while making you believe in a world from 1912. It used the machinery of the late 20th century to reconstruct the confidence of the early 20th, then placed both forms of confidence in the path of an ice bulb. That tension mattered because the film itself appeared to many people like an act of dangerous confidence. At the time, it was reported as the most expensive movie yet made, and its difficult production became part of the story surrounding its release. The summer opening was moved to December while the film was still being completed, and the scale of the investment encouraged predictions that Cameron's epic might become a disaster about a disaster. Before audiences had seen the blue water, the chandeliers, or the ship rising against the horizon, the public narrative was already one of excess and risk. That is important because it means Titanic entered cinemas carrying two stories of possible failure. One belonged to 1912, the other belonged to Hollywood in 1997. The ship embodied engineering and industrial power. The film embodied design, effects, and directorial control. Both were defined by scale and surrounded by doubt. And while it would be too neat to treat the production as a mirror of the historical tragedy, the parallel gave the release an unusual energy. People were not only going to see whether the ship would sink, they were going to see whether the movie would. Then something remarkable happened. The anxiety surrounding the production was replaced by participation. The film became a worldwide phenomenon, made Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet global stars, and drew people back to theaters in a pattern of repeat viewing that became central to its cultural identity. The scale that had looked reckless began to feel inevitable, as though the movie had created a shared emotional language. You can feel why. The late 1990s were moving toward a more digital, faster, increasingly ironic popular culture. Yet Titanic was almost defiantly sincere. It did not protect itself with detachment. It did not apologize for romance, grief, beauty, or melodrama. It placed emotion at the center of an expensive spectacle and trusted people to meet it there. That trust became part of the divide around the film. Many critics admired its craft, construction, performances, and ability to sustain a family romantic form inside an overwhelming historical event. Roger Ebert's contemporary praised the film's workmanship and its capacity to hold attention across its long-running time. But the very qualities that moved millions also made the film easy to resist. Its directness could be called obvious, its romance could be called sentimental, its dialogue could be reduced to punchlines, its popularity became so vast that disliking it could feel like a way of stepping outside the crowd. This is one of the strangest things that can happen to a beloved film. Once an image becomes universal, people stop looking at it closely. The bow becomes a pose, the music a joke, and the romance a handful of familiar gestures. Cultural familiarity flattens the very thing it celebrates, and yet the film kept returning. It returned through home video, entering living rooms, family shows, and repeated private viewings. It returned through major theatrical releases, allowing its spectacle to be renewed for people who at first encountered it on smaller screens. The Academy itself describes the film as both a lasting home video favorite and a work that generated a significant return to cinemas. Its return slightly changed the blue. In 1997, that blue belonged to newness. It was the color of visual effects asking you to believe your eyes. It was the cold edge of an event movie whose scale seemed almost impossible. Years later, the same blue became nostalgic. It carried memories of crowded screenings, worn tapes, television broadcasts, and the strange intimacy of knowing exactly what will happen while still hoping the characters might somehow escape it. This is why the film feels both timeless and perfectly tied to its era. It is tied to the 90s through its confidence in the theatrical event, its faith in the global movie star, its fusion of practical construction and digital illusion, and its belief that one enormous film could become a shared cultural appointment, but it is timeless in the older instincts it embraces. The story draws on class division, forbidden attraction, catastrophe, and love intensified by limited time. These are not modern inventions, they belong to myths, melodrama, and tragedy. They are what confirmed that the industry saw more than commercial success. At the 70th Academy Awards, Titanic received 14 nominations and won 11, including Best Picture and Best Director, along with recognition for cinematography, editing, design, sound, music, and visual effects. Kate Winslet and Gloria Stewart were nominated for their performances, but neither won, and Leonardo DiCaprio was not nominated. The pattern is revealing. The film was honored most heavily as an achievement of total construction, a machine in which image, sound, movement, design, and scale worked together. Those awards were deserved. The film's command of craft is not decoration around the emotion. It is the system that makes the emotion possible. The sets give class a physical architecture. The editing turns distance into urgency. The sound makes metal feel mortal. The visual effects allow beauty and destruction to inhabit the same image. What may have been overlooked was how much of the film's power depends on feminine experience. Rose is not simply the person through whom we enter the ship. She is the person through whom the film measures confinement. Her clothing, posture, meals, conversations, and future have all been arranged by other people. The disaster plot is enormous, but her private crisis begins before the iceberg appears. Cameron's spectacle became famous as a feat of masculine technical ambition, while its emotional endurance rests largely on a young woman learning to recognize control and choose life. Let me also explain why some of the early devotion surrounding the film was treated dismissively. Popular culture often mistrusts intense feeling when young women express it openly. Repeat viewing could be mocked as obsession rather than understood as engagement. Tears could be treated as evidence of naivete rather than a response to form, performance, music, and mortality. But emotional seriousness is not cancer by popularity. A film does not become shallow merely because millions of people know where it hurts. And Titanic knew exactly where to place that hurt. It placed it between luxury and panic, between the belief that systems will protect us and the moment those systems reveal whom they were designed to protect first, between the modern hunger for spectacle and an old human fear of being forgotten. The cultural world of 1997 saw a technological marvel. The film looked back to 1912 and found another technological marvel beneath the Atlantic. One was rising into public view as the other remained in darkness. The blue water connected them. It reminded a century approaching the digital future that progress does not erase vulnerability. It reminded an industry obsessed with opening weekends that people would still sit for more than 3 hours if a film gave them wonder, intimacy, and grief in the same breath. And it reminded audiences who already knew the ending that knowing a tragedy is not the same as feeling its human weight. With that word around it, the doubt, the scale, the sincerity, the adoration, and the backlash, the ship is finally ready to enter the frame, not as a historical fact or a production gamble, but as the living word of a story, and when the ship enters the frame as a living word, it does so in sunlight. That contrast matters. The wreck we first encounter is blue, corroded, and almost weightless in the dark. The Titanic of 1912 arrived in warm daylight, its black hull cutting across the screen with the authority of something that seems too large to belong to ordinary life. Steam rises, crowds gather, luggage moves through the port. The ship does not yet look like a tomb. It looks like certainty made physical. Released in 1997, Titanic was written and directed by James Cameron. Leonardo DiCaprio plays Jack Dawson, a young artist traveling without wealth or social standing, while Kate Winslet plays Rose DeWitt Bukater, a young woman crossing the Atlantic inside the rigid expectations of privilege. Billy Zane appears as Ken Hopley, the wealthy fiancé whose polished manners conceal a need for ownership. Frances Fisher plays Rose's mother, Ruth, and Kathy Bates brings blunt warmth to the newly wealthy Margaret Brown. Gloria Stewart portrays Rose in old age, the keeper of the memory through which the film returns to the ship. Calling it a historical romance is accurate, but incomplete. It is also a disaster film, a class drama, a coming-of-age story, and a piece of cinematic archaeology. Cameron takes an event whose destination is known and builds suspense around a different question, not whether the ship survives, but whether a person can become fully present in her own life before the world around her collapses. The story begins from the future, with a deep-sea expedition searching the wreck for a valuable object. That search brings an elderly Rose back into contact with a version of herself preserved by history but misunderstood by those examining it. The researchers know the dimensions of the ship, the path of its descent, and the location of its remains. What they do not know is what it felt like to be alive inside it. Rose supplies that missing element. Through her memory, the Titanic becomes more than engineering achievement or a famous catastrophe. It becomes a social world arranged vertically. Wealth occupies the grand rooms and open promenades above. Immigrants and working class passengers live in the compartments below. The architecture does not merely separate ticket prices, it turns hierarchy into distance, doors, staircases, dining customs, and permission. Class is something you can see in the size of a room and here in the way a person is addressed. Rose stands near the top of that structure, but the film immediately reveals the difference between comfort and freedom. She possesses beautiful clothes, formal education, and access to luxury, yet almost every part of her future has been negotiated without her. Her engagement is treated as a solution to financial insecurity, her behavior is watched, her emotions are corrected, even her body seems required to obey the shape imposed by etiquette and clothing. Jack exists at the opposite end of the ship. He owns almost nothing, and the instability of his life is real. Yet Cameron gives him a freedom of movement that Rose lacks. He sketches, travels, improvises, and responds to people before responding to status. The film does not pretend poverty is secretly comfortable, nor does it offer Jack's life as a simple cure for Rose's problems. What he brings is the possibility of another way of seeing. He notices the person beneath the performance. That is the emotional engine of Titanic. It is not merely that two young people from different classes are attracted to each other. It is that one of them has been trained to disappear inside a socially acceptable identity, while the other recognizes the disappearance as it is happening. DiCaprio's openness is crucial. Jack could have become a symbol rather than a person, the charming outsider designed to rescue the trapped woman. But DiCaprio plays him with alertness and ease. He listens quickly. He moves as though the world is available to be entered. His confidence is not the cold certainty of the upper decks, it is curiosity. Winslet has the more difficult task because Rose must be restrained and vivid at once. Her anger cannot always be spoken, her fear has to live beneath posture, costume, and ceremony. Winslet you sense the force gathering inside her long before Rose can name it herself. When she looks across a room, the film often seems to split into two realities, the elegant surface everyone else accepts, and the suffocating structure she can no longer ignore. Cameron's vision depends on this relationship between surface and pressure. His films often place human beings inside systems that seem stronger than they are, machines, institutions, environments, and technologies built with confidence but vulnerable to forces their creators underestimate. Here, that instinct becomes unusually tender. Their ship is a machine, but Rose's arranged future is also a machine. Both are impressive from the outside, both rely on obedience, both are moving toward a collision. So, should you watch Titanic? Yes, especially if familiarity has reduced it to a collection of famous images. Watch it not because you do not know what happens, but because knowing allows you to notice how carefully it happens. Watch the way the film turns architecture into emotion. Watch how music and silence alter the temperature of the blue surrounding the ship. Watch how the romance creates movement across spaces designed to keep people apart. You may resist its direct sentiment, its broad strokes, or the certainty with which it reaches for your emotions. The film does not whisper every feeling. Sometimes it lets the orchestra carry it across the ocean, but its sincerity is part of its courage. Titanic believes that spectacle and tenderness can strengthen each other, that history becomes meaningful through individual experience, and that a story known by millions can still feel private when it finds the right human face. Before the chord enters, before the deck still and the blue becomes a threat, the film gives us a floating world in golden light. Then it asks us to look at the young woman standing inside that brightness and notice that she is already searching for air. That search for air begins in a place where no human being can breathe. The opening movement of Titanic takes us beneath the Atlantic, into the blue darkness surrounding the wreck. Before the film restores the ship, it makes us confront what remains of it. Mechanical cameras plied through broken windows and collapsed rooms, lights reveal fragments for only a few seconds before the water closes over them again. There is no panic here, no screaming metal, no visible crowd. The catastrophe has already passed. What remains is stillness. For a film famous for noise, scale, romance, and destruction, this is an unexpectedly patient beginning. Cameron could have opened with the Titanic at the height of its beauty. He could have introduced the love story immediately or begun with a spectacular image of departure. Instead, he begins with absence. The first emotional rhythm is not excitement, it is mourning. The wreck is shown as both an object and a wound. The expedition treats it as a site to be mapped, entered, and searched, but the images resist becoming merely technical. Rust hangs from the railings like fabric. Corridors that once directed people through a strict social order now lead nowhere. Rooms built to display status have been reduced to outlines in the dark. The ocean has erased the difference between first class and steerage. Every surface now belongs to the same blue silence. This creates a strange tension in the opening. The people operating the expedition equipment are energetic and practical. They speak in the language of targets, machinery, and recovery. Their excitement tells us that they see possibility below, yet the camera keeps reminding us that this possibility exists inside a grave. The technology allows them to enter the past physically, but not emotionally. That distinction becomes the key to the entire film. A machine can move through a doorway, but it cannot remember who stood there. A computer can reconstruct the ship's final descent, but it cannot explain what it meant to feel the floor tilt beneath your feet. An object can be recovered, catalogued, and valued, but its meaning remains incomplete until someone connects it to a life. The premise of Titanic might lead you to expect immediate grandeur. You know the ship will appear. You know there will be a romance and a disaster. The title itself carries an enormous cultural weight before the film begins. It promises scale, historical tragedy, and spectacle, but the opening refuses to hurry toward those promises. It creates distance first. That distance changes the way everything afterward feels. When we eventually see the ship in 1912, we don't see it innocently. The wreck remains beneath the image. Every polished surface carries the ghost of corrosion. Every room is already doubled, the space as it was and the space as it will become. The opening places memory underneath the entire film, like the dark ocean beneath the moving hull. This is why the early images of archival style departure footage feel so important. They do not simply provide historical texture, they position us as people looking backward. We are not entering an unknown future alongside the passengers. We are watching a future they cannot see approach them. Their gestures appear ordinary, waving, carrying luggage, preparing for a journey, but knowledge changes the emotional value of ordinary movement. A hand raised in farewell becomes heavier when you know it may be the final goodbye. Cameron then shifts from the silence of the wreck to the busy confidence of the expedition vessel. The transition is not subtle in volume, but it is precise in meaning. The dead ship is quiet, the living surge above it is loud. Equipment moves, monitors glow, and the crew celebrates the recovery of a safe they believe may contain a legendary jewel. The past has become a source of excitement, prestige, and potential wealth. The blue now feels less like mourning and more like a barrier. Something is down there, hidden beneath pressure and time, and the people above believe they can bring it into the light. Yet, when the safe is opened, the desired treasure is missing. What they find instead is an image of a young woman wearing it. This is the opening's first quiet correction. The expedition is searching for a valuable object, but the film gives them a person. Not the person herself, not yet, but the trace of one. A face, a posture, a moment preserved by an artist's hand. The drawing has no financial value comparable to the jewel, yet it carries the emotional mystery the jewel cannot provide. It asks who she was, why she was there, and what happened around the moment the image was made. The atmosphere begins to change. The film is no longer only descending into a wreck. It is moving toward a consciousness. When the elderly Rose recognizes the drawing on television, the blue distance between past and present begins to narrow. Her reaction is controlled, but the film allows a pause around her. To everyone else, the image is evidence. To her, it is a door. The young woman in the drawing has not disappeared, even though nearly a lifetime stands between them. Gloria Stewart's presence introduces a softness the expedition scenes lack. She does not approach the Titanic as a puzzle to be solved. She carries it as something unfinished. Her age gives the opening an immediate sense of time scale. The wreck is not ancient history. It exists within a human memory, and this is where the emotional rhythm of the opening reveals itself completely. Titanic does not begin by asking how the ship sank. It begins by asking who has the right to tell us what the sinking meant. The researchers possess diagrams, footage, measurements, and theories. Rose possesses sensation. She remembers the light, the people, the rooms, and the version of herself who boarded. Her memory is not presented as a data archive, it is shaped by longing, pain, affection, and survival. That subjectivity is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. The opening therefore prepares us for something more intimate than the premise suggests. We may expect a disaster epic, but the film establishes the rhythm of a confession. We may expect history, but the camera waits for memory. We may expect a monument to scale, but the first truly meaningful object is a handmade drawing. The blue water surrounding the wreck no longer represents only death. It becomes the distance a memory must travel to be heard. And once Rose begins to speak, the film does not simply bring the Titanic back. It allows a lost self to rise with it. That lost self rises into a morning filled with smoke, movement, and gold. The Titanic appears not as a museum object but as a world assembling itself. Carriages arrive, porters carry trunks, families press toward the gangways. Wealth moves with ceremony, while those with less move with urgency. Cameron introduces the ship through human traffic because he wants its size to be felt socially before it is felt mechanically. Rose enters that hierarchy almost as part of the luggage. Her clothes are immaculate, her posture composed, and her arrival framed by servants, relatives, and expectations. She looks at the ship and sees its scale, but not with Jack's wonder. For him, the Titanic represents motion. For her, it represents enclosure disguised as opportunity. That difference defines their first movements through the story. Jack boards by chance after winning passage in a card game. The moment is fast, improvised, and full of momentum. He and his companion run toward the ship as though possibility itself might pull away without them. Rose boards surrounded by order. Her possessions have already been arranged. Her future has already been discussed. Even the road she will travel through the ship has been prepared. One character enters with almost nothing and feels free. The other enters with almost everything and cannot breathe. Cameron makes that contrast visible in the spaces they inhabit. First class is wide, polished, and carefully symmetrical. Its staircase is geared with theatrical elegance. Its dining rooms turn meals into rituals of belonging. But the openness is deceptive. Rose is watched in every room. A gesture can be corrected. A preference can be dismissed. A silence can be interpreted on her behalf. Below deck, the rooms are smaller and the corridors tighter, yet movement feels less controlled. People speak loudly, carry their own bags, and occupy space without pretending that every action has been approved. Upper class space offers comfort without spontaneity. Lower deck space offers community without security. The ship therefore becomes character driven and word driven at the same time. Rose and Jack make choices, but the architecture determines which choices feel possible. Their relationship is not developing in an empty romantic landscape. It is crossing a structure built to prevent people like them from meeting as equals. Before they do meet, the film lets us feel Rose's isolation from inside her composure. She attends meals, listens to plans for her life, and moves through ornate rooms as though performing a role in a production she never agreed to join. Around her, the conversation treats wealth as protection and marriage as strategy. Her engagement is presented as an economic rescue for her family, with Rose herself serving as the prize. This is why her despair cannot be reduced to youthful rebellion. She is not upset because society has asked her to follow a few unpleasant rules. She senses that her entire identity is being converted into an asset. The future being offered to her is comfortable, respected, and spiritually airless. The film visualizes that feeling by moving her toward the edge of the ship. At night, the bright interiors give way to open blackness. The ocean no longer appears as the blue of memory. It is an absence beyond the railing, vast enough to erase every demand placed upon her. Rose moves toward that darkness because in that moment disappearance feels like the only decision that still belongs to her. Then Jack sees her. What matters is not that he arrives as a heroic rescuer. The scene works because he recognizes that authority will push her farther away. He does not address her as a social category or speak to her with the polished certainty she hears elsewhere. He responds to her fear practically, calmly, and without turning it into a performance. He creates a small space in which she can choose to step back. Even here, the ship's class system immediately reshapes the event. When others arrive, appearances become more important than what Rose was feeling. Jack's clothing and position make him suspicious. Rose's explanation protects him, but it also hides the truth of her despair. The social world restores its surface almost at once. That surface is represented most forcefully by Kate. He does not merely dislike Jack, he struggles with the existence of anything in Rose that he cannot control. His gifts, manners, and gestures of affection repeatedly carry the pressure of ownership. The more Rose awakens, the more threatening her inner life becomes to him. The film paints Cal in bold strokes because Titanic operates partly as melodrama. Feelings become architecture. Power becomes costume, posture, and access. Threat is not hidden so deeply that we mistake it for love. This directness allows the central romance to develop with unusual speed. Jack is invited into first class society as a reward for helping Rose, and the dinner sequence turns class into performance. He is surrounded by people who believe refinement belongs naturally to them, yet his ease exposes how artificial their rituals can be. He does not defeat them through knowledge of etiquette. He survives by refusing to be ashamed. Rose watches him do something she has not yet learned to do, enter a room without surrendering his sense of self. The film's pacing begins to loosen around them. Early scenes move through schedules, introductions, and social obligations. Once Rose follows Jad below deck, the rhythm changes. Music becomes faster. Bodies move without formal permission. The camera joins the dance rather than observing it from a respectful distance. The floor is crowded, the air warm, and every gesture seems to push against the stillness of first class. This is where the sensory motif changes again. Blue had been distance, mourning, and danger. Below deck, warmth temporarily replaces it. The film creates a pocket of life inside the ship, and Rose's movement becomes freer with every beat. Her laughter is not simply evidence that she likes Jack, it is the sound of effort falling away. The sequence matters because freedom is presented as physical before it becomes philosophical. Rose does not begin with a speech about autonomy. She runs, dances, drinks, loses balance, and allows herself to be ungraceful. Her body escapes the posture assigned to it before her mind can fully reject the future assigned to her. But morning restores surveillance. Her mother and Cal understand that Jack's presence is dangerous not because he lacks manners, but because he has shown Rose another emotional reality. Once a person discovers that life can feel different, control becomes harder to disguise as duty. The pressure around her tightens. What had been expressed through polite correction becomes explicit warning. Rose initially retreats. That retreat is important. The film does not portray liberation as an immediate clean decision. She has been shaped by family obligation, financial fear, social conditioning, and the knowledge that refusing her engagement will carry consequences beyond herself. Jack can identify the cage, but Rose is the one who must decide whether the uncertainty outside it is worth entering. Their conversation on the ship's deck becomes a turning point because Jack refuses to romanticize her surrender. He sees that she is moving toward a life in which her vitality will be gradually reduced. He cannot promise security. What he offers is recognition. He describes the danger not as dramatic ruin but as slow disappearance. Rose walks away from him, and for a while the story seems to return her to the path chosen for her. Cameron then places her among images of other women living inside that path. She watches a child being trained in the gestures of upper class femininity, learning how to sit, place a napkin, and occupy as little disruptive space as possible. It is a small scene, but it condenses Rose's whole future. Control is passed down not only through commands, but through imitation. A young girl learns the performance before she is old enough to question who wrote it. The sight changes Rose because it makes her captivity visible from the outside. She is no longer only feeling trapped. She is seeing the mechanism reproduce itself. When she returns to Jack, the decision is emotional, but it is also ethical. She chooses not to become the person that system is preparing her to be. The famous moment at the bow works because it externalizes that choice through space. Jack brings her to the front of the ship, where there is no wall immediately before her and no table arranging her posture. He asks her to trust balance, wind, and movement. The ocean beneath them is blue again, but its meaning has transformed. It is no longer the sealed darkness around the lake or the void Rose approached in despair. It becomes openness. The same vastness that once suggested erasure now suggests a life without a visible boundary. Cameron films the moment with complete sincerity. The music rises, the horizon widens. Rose extends her arms and experiences movement not as transportation toward an arranged future, but as presence. She is still aboard the same ship. Nothing material has changed. Yet the world feels different because she is standing inside it differently. That is what this film understands about freedom. Before it becomes a permanent condition, it often arrives as a sensation, a breath taken without permission, a view unobstructed, the realization that your body belongs to you. The romance deepens through acts of attention rather than through long explanation. Rose enters Jack's artistic world and asks to be seen outside the identity created for her. The drawing sequence is intimate because it reverses the terms under which she has been observed. Cal sees her as a possession to display. Society sees her as a role to maintain. Jack looks carefully, but the choice to be looked at is hers. The valuable necklace becomes part of that reversal. It was given as a symbol of wealth and attachment, but Rose wears it while stepping outside the meaning Carl intended. An object associated with possession enters an image created through voluntary trust. The jewel remains expensive, yet the drawing becomes more emotionally valuable because it records a moment of self-authorship. Cameron keeps the sequence restrained enough that stillness becomes its own form of intensity. Jack's concentration, Rose's controlled nervousness, and the sound of pencil moving across paper create a space apart from the ship's public life. Here, Rose is not being prepared for display. She is collaborating in the creation of an image. Their escape afterward changes the rhythm again. The film moves from stillness into pursuit, from controlled observation into play. They run through corridors and descend into the ship's working spaces, crossing boundaries that had seemed socially fixed. The route is romantic, but it is also symbolic. They move from the polished upper decks and toward the mechanical body that makes all that elegance possible. Deep inside the ship, heat replaces blue. Engines turn, metal moves, workers feed the enormous system carrying everyone forward. The lovers' private rebellion unfolds beside machinery that cannot simply stop because their lives have changed. The ship continues obeying its course. In the cargo hold, their intimacy becomes a declaration made in borrowed space. The film treats the moment as emotional culmination rather than conquest. Rose chooses closeness, chooses desire, and chooses an experience that belongs neither to her mother nor to Cal. The hand against the misted glass is memorable not because it explains anything, but because it reduces the grand romance to a brief human trace. Heat, breath, pressure, then disappearance. When they return to the open deck, the world seems suspended. They have crossed class boundaries, escaped surveillance, and created a private future in their imagination. Rose speaks as though the arranged life behind her can now be refused. Jack believes her. For a few moments, the ship appears to carry them toward possibility. But the film has never allowed us to forget the water. The night is unnaturally calm. The surface is dark and smooth, with no waves breaking visibly around what lies ahead. Lookouts search the black distance. Officers maintain speed. Confidence continues moving through the ship like an invisible current. The pacing narrows. Romance gives way to observation. The camera moves outward from the lovers toward the vessel, the sea, and the cold shape waiting beyond the reach of certainty. Human choices have transformed Rose's inner world, but another movement has been unfolding without them. The blue that once offered openness now begins to harden into ice. And here is where the film shifts completely. That shift from romance into catastrophe begins with ice, but the making of Titanic began by moving in the opposite direction, down through black water toward the real ship. James Cameron's fascination with the wreck was not a decorative research step added after the screenplay had taken shape. The Academy's collection notes that he made multiple dives to the actual remains, and the opening expedition incorporates images gathered at the site. The production therefore began by confronting the physical truth of what time and pressure had done. Before rebuilding polished corridors, Cameron had seen their ruined forms in the deep. That fact changes the way the opening feels. The wreck is not presented as a generic haunted vessel created entirely on a soundstage. The camera's movement carries the hesitation of an encounter. Its light reaches only so far. Details emerge and vanish because the ocean refuses complete access. The blue is not merely a color choice there, it is the material distance between the filmmakers and the history they are trying to approach. Yet a wreck can show what was lost without showing how it once lived. To make the tragedy emotionally legible, the production had to reverse decay. At Fox Baja Studios in Mexico, the filmmakers built the enormous environment used for the period and shipboard sequences. Cinematographer Russell Carpenter joined the project as that work expanded, following Caleb Deschanel's photography of the present-day material in Nova Scotia. This was more than a practical solution for giving actors a convincing background. Physical scare changes performance. When Rose walks along a promenade, the distance behind her is real enough to affect her pace. When Jack looks upward from the lower levels, the ship's hierarchy is not an abstract idea added later. It rises around him. Railings, staircases, windows, and decks give the actors surfaces to touch and boundaries to cross. You can sense that material reality in the romance. The actors are not floating in front of a beautiful historical illustration. They lean into wind, run through corridors, descend actual stairs, and occupy rooms whose proportions communicate privilege before anyone speaks. Production design becomes social pressure. A ceiling can make a person feel contained. A staircase can turn an entrance into a public performance. A narrow passage can transform class separation into a visible obstacle. The casting had to remain alive inside all of that construction. Cameron has described Kate Winslet as an early, clear choice, while Leonardo DiCaprio initially needed convincing that Jack contained enough difficulty to challenge him. Cameron's argument was essentially that apparent ease was the challenge. Jack had to feel open and spontaneous without becoming shallow. The balance between them is delicate. If Jack feels too polished, he begins to resemble another form of control. If Rose appears only passive, her awakening feels imposed from outside. Instead, his looseness creates room while her intensity gives that room consequence. Their chemistry does not erase the class difference, it makes the difference emotionally visible. Every shared scene asks whether two people can meet honestly inside a world that has already assigned their value. The distinction reshapes the role. Jack is not burdened with a dense psychological explanation because his dramatic function is expressed through presence. He moves easily where Rose has been taught to hesitate. He attends to people whom the social world overlooks. DiCaprio's task is to make freedom feel embodied rather than announced, and his lack of visible strain becomes part of the performance. Winslet brings the opposite energy. Rose must reveal effort beneath elegance. Her costumes, posture, and social position create a carefully designed surface, while the performance lets frustration press against it. The film marks because neither actor is swallowed by the ship. Their faces remain the emotional scale against which every technical achievement is measured. The technical achievement itself was not produced by a single method. American Cinematographer's Archive describes an integration of traditional miniatures with computer-generated extensions, motion-captured passengers, and added smoke and water effects. The filmmakers did not choose between physical craft and digital invention. They layered them until the boundaries became difficult to feel. That combination is why the ship can feel both monumental and inhabited. A model can provide weight, surface, and the behavior of light across metal. digital work can extend scale, populate distant decks, and allow the camera to travel through space in ways a full-size set cannot. Neither technique is asked to carry the illusion alone. More importantly, the effects are usually organized around human activity. The ship is convincing not simply because its dimensions appear correct, but because tiny figures move across it, smoke leaves its funnels, water parts around its hull, and the decks seem to contain hundreds of private destinations. Scale becomes meaningful through life. Without people, the Titanic would be architecture. With them, it becomes a temporary civilization. The same principle governs the sinking. The spectacle is never only a demonstration of how a structure breaks. Every change in the ship changes the possibilities available to the people aboard it. A rising deck alters balance, water entering a corridor changes direction, darkness removes certainty. The visual effects are dramatic because they keep rewriting human space. And then there is the blue. In a response preserved by the American Society of Cinematographers, Carpenter explained that intense blue appearance in the final portion of the film was largely achieved by photographing tungsten balance film beneath uncorrected MI lighting. A technical mismatch became the emotional atmosphere of the disaster. Think about what that means. The cold is not conveyed only by actors trembling or by frost forming in the air. It enters the image itself. Skin, clothing, metal, and water are drawn into the same merciless temperature. Earlier, blue belonged to distance and possibility. Here, the lighting removes warmth from the world until survival seems to depend on finding any remaining pocket of it. The choice also separates the ship's two lives. Before the collision, interiors glow with amber light. Wood, brass, fabric, and skin appear protected inside a manufactured warmth. After the electrical life of the ship begins to fail, that protection drains away. The blue waiting outside moves inward. What seemed like a secure human world is slowly recolored by the environment it believed it could master. This is where the making of Titanic becomes inseparable from its meaning. Cameron's fluorides gave the film contact with loss. The constructed ship gave the actors a physical society to inhabit. The casting placed contrasting forms of freedom and restraint at its center. Miniatures and digital effects gave the vessel scale and movement. Carpenter's lighting allowed the ocean's coldness to become visible even before it touched the characters. None of these facts matters merely because the production was difficult. Difficulty is not automatically artistry. What matters is how each solution appears on screen as feeling. Research becomes mourning, construction becomes class, effects become vulnerability, light becomes cold. The film was built through control so that it could show control failing. And as the iceberg opens the hull beneath the waterline, every piece of that craft begins working toward the same transformation. The magnificent ship must stop feeling like a setting and become a living body discovering that it can bleed. That living body is what allows every department of Titanic to work toward the same emotional result. The performances, the screenplay, the framing, the music, and the sound design do not sit beside one another like separate achievements. They move together, each one teaching us how to feel the ship before it asks us to fear for it. Kate Winslet is the center of that design. Rose begins the film surrounded by surfaces that have already decided what she should look like. Hats frame her face, corsets regulate her posture. Dining rooms control how she sits, when she speaks, and how much of herself can appear without becoming inconvenient. Winslet's performance is powerful because she never treats restraint as emptiness. Even when Rose is still, thought moves visibly behind her eyes. Irritation flashes and is suppressed. Curiosity appears before she allows herself to follow it. Panic presses against elegance. The scene that proves the performance most completely arrives when Rose sits at dinner after having briefly encountered another way of living. She is physically present among people discussing the future, as though it were already settled, yet Winslet plays the moment as an internal separation. Her body remains at the table, but her attention has moved elsewhere. The smallest reactions reveal that the life around her has become newly unbearable. Nothing outwardly spectacular happens. That is precisely why the scene matters. Rose's rebellion becomes convincing before she acts on it, because Winslet lets us watch it form. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance walks through an opposite rhythm. Jack is open where Rose is guarded. quick where she is measured, physically loose where she has been trained into stillness. DiCaprio gives him a social intelligence that is easy to overlook. Jack reads rooms quickly. He understands when humor will release pressure, when directness is necessary, and when another person needs space rather than instruction. His strongest moments are not the ones in which he appears fearless, they are the moments when his confidence becomes attentiveness. At this turn, he recognizes that Rose does not need another person trying to control her. During the drawing, he allows concentration to replace charm. At dinner, he does not imitate the people around him so much as refuse their assumption that he should feel inferior. DiCaprio makes freedom feel less like recklessness than emotional availability. Together, Winslet and DiCaprio create movement inside Cameron's broad romantic structure. Jack does not simply awaken Rose. He responds to the part of her that is already awake and being forced back into silence. Rose does not simply fall for Jack, she begins choosing the self that can meet him honestly. Their chemistry works because it is built through recognition. Each becomes more visible in the presence of the other. Billy Zane performs Cal with deliberate hardness, but the performance is more controlled than the character's symbolic role might suggest. Carl believes Welch should protect him not only from discomfort but from contradiction. San lets entitlement appear first as composure. The threat intensifies when that composure fails. His anger does not feel like a sudden transformation into another person. It feels like the hidden meaning of his politeness finally becoming audible. Frances Fisher gives Ruth a colder form of desperation. She enforces the system that traps Rose, yet the screenplay allows us to understand the fear beneath her control. Her social position is more fragile than it appears, and Rose's marriage is the structure she believes will prevent collapse. Understanding that fear does not excuse what she asks of her daughter. It makes the conflict more painful because oppression is shown reproducing itself through people who are also afraid. This is one of the screenplay's most effective choices. It makes class visible without allowing the romance to float free of economics. Rose is not simply choosing between two men. She is choosing between two ideas of life, and one of those ideas is supported by money, family expectation, reputation, and law. Jack can offer a new way of seeing, but he cannot erase the material consequences of Rose's refusal. The screenplay is often broad, and some of its dialogue serves function before subtlety. But its architecture is remarkably clear. The present-day search establishes the difference between information and memory. The early shipboard scenes establish class through movement and space. The romance carries Rose across those boundaries. The collision then forces the entire social design of the ship to reveal its moral meaning. Objects are used with similar precision. The drawing becomes proof that Rose once chose how she would be seen. The necklace moves between gift, possession, accusation, and memory. Doors and gates recur not merely as obstacles, but as expressions of who is permitted to move. Lifeboats begin as background equipment and gradually become measures of value, fear, and access. What makes the writing more than functional is the way these elements change meaning. Nothing important remains emotionally fixed. The grand staircase is first an image of status, then a stage for romantic recognition, and later a space whose beauty cannot protect anyone. The ocean is first distance, then freedom, then threat. Even the ship's size changes. At departure, it seems to offer limitless rooms and possibilities. After the collision, every corridor feels like part of a narrowing maze. Cameron's visual language makes those transformations immediate. He frequently frames the ship through vertical relationships. First class looks down. Steerage looks up. Staircases, elevators, ladders, and decks turn social hierarchy into physical direction. Rose's emotional journey repeatedly involves crossing those lines, moving downward into warmth and community, then upward into open air. The camel itself changes character depending on the world it enters. In formal spaces, movement is measured. Compositions emphasize symmetry, polished surfaces, and distance between bodies. Below deck, the camera becomes more responsive and crowded. It turns with dancers, catches gestures at the edge of the frame, and allows disorder to feel alive rather than threatening. During intimate scenes, Cameron often reduces the apparent size of the film. The huge production disappears behind faces, hands, breath, and eye contact. This is crucial. Spectacle becomes emotionally meaningful only because the film knows when to stop displaying itself. A speed built to astonish us becomes background to the movement of a pencil across paper or the hesitation before a hand is taken. Then when danger arrives, the camera expands again. Long views remind us of scale, while closer images show how that scale breaks into individual decisions. Cameron alternates between the ship as a whole and the person inside a corridor because tragedy exists at both distances. From far away, the vessel is a beautiful object meeting a physical force. Up close, it is a collection of people discovering that the systems around them may not save them. Russell Carpenter's cinematography gives that movement a temperature. The early interiors glow with amber and gold. Faces appear protected by chandeliers, polished wood, and soft light. The warmth is attractive, but it is also artificial, produced and maintained by the ship. Outside, blue waits beyond the windows. As the crisis develops, the separation between those colors becomes unstable. Cold light enters spaces that had seemed sealed against it. The blue no longer belongs only to the ocean or the future wreck. It spreads across skin and metal, making the environment feel less human with every stage of the disaster. The visual design turns temperature into narrative. James Horner's score performs a similar transformation through sound. Its central musical ideas carry longing before they carry grief. The voice floating above the orchestra seems to arrive from a distance the characters cannot yet understand, as though memory were already singing over events that have not happened. The music gives the romance a scale larger than the conversations themselves, but it also places fragility inside that scale. Horner's when melody should guide emotion openly. Titanic does not pretend that feeling must always be hidden to be sophisticated. The score rises when the film wants release wonder or sorrow. Its power also comes from repetition with altered contexts. A mystical idea first associated with possibility can return after that possibility has changed, carrying memory inside the same notes. The score's romantic sweep is balanced by the physical sound of the ship. Engines pulse below conversations, steam escapes. Dishes, doors, footsteps, and machinery create a constant sense that this floating world is being actively maintained. The ship never feels completely silent while it is healthy. It breathes through labor and mechanism. After the collision, sound begins to expose vulnerability. Metal groans, water enters with a force that does not need exaggeration. Footsteps accelerate, instructions overlap, the familiar mechanical body of the vessel develops unfamiliar noises, and those noises communicate danger before every character understands it. Silence is used as pressure rather than absence. When music withdraws, you hear distance, cold, and uncertainty. A pause before impact stretches time, because the film briefly removes the emotional guidance of melody. Later, quiet moments among the noise become more painful because they isolate one human response from the larger catastrophe. What this film achieves then is not simply impressive coordination. It creates a single emotional system. Performance gives us people worth following. Writing turns class and memory into dramatic movement. Framing makes power spatial. Light makes safety temporary. Music gives private feeling historical scale. Sound lets the ship's confidence crack before our ears. And through all of it, the blue keeps moving closer. It begins outside the characters, beneath them and beyond them. Then it enters the windows, the corridors, the skin, and finally the emotional world of the film. Warmth becomes something people must create for one another because the structure around them can no longer provide it. That is why the achievement of Titanic is not merely that it makes a lost ship appear real. It makes every layer of cinema ask the same human question. When the world grows cold, what remains warm enough to carry us through it? That question is answered most clearly in the moments when Titanic stops explaining itself. For a film remembered through music, declarations, crowds, and catastrophe, some of its most revealing choices are built from pause. Cameron understands that silence is not the absence of meaning. It is the instant before meaning hardens into language, when a face, a room, or the distance between two bodies can tell us what speech would only reduce. Rose is often most legible when she says nothing. At the beginning, she moves through first-class spaces with the composed stillness expected of her, but the camera repeatedly holds long enough for that performance to fracture. She looks at a table setting, a conversation, or another woman being shaped by the same rules, and the film allows the recognition to remain unspoken. No one around her notices the change. We do. That gap is essential. Rose lives among people who interpret her before she can interpret herself. Her mother translates fear into duty. Care translates possession into care. The social world translates obedience into maturity. Silence becomes the only place where Rose's own response can exist without being corrected. Winslet fills those pauses with contradiction. Her face can hold anger and shame, resistance and exhaustion, curiosity and caution at the same time. The camera does not rush to decide which emotion matters most, it lets them coexist. That is closer to how entrapment feels, not one clean emotion but several pressing against one another. Jack's silences operate differently. He is usually expressive, but when he becomes quiet, the film reveals his attention. During the drawing sequence, charm falls away. The room becomes still enough for concentration to feel intimate. The pencil against paper matters because language has temporarily become unnecessary. Rose has chosen the terms of the encounter, and Jack's silence honors that choice. The camera observes gestures, posture, and the fragile uncertainty of being seen. Rose's change is visible in the difference between being looked at as property and being looked at with care. The pose sequence is remembered for music and scale, but its emotional foundation is spatial silence. Rose stands before an open horizon with nothing immediately enclosing her. Wind, breath, and distance replace instruction. Before the score carries the moment upward, the image has already made the point. She occupies space without apology. The ocean is crucial because it does not tell Rose who she is. Its vastness can be frightening, but it is free of social language. The same blue that once offered disappearance now gives her a surface against which she can feel her own presence. Cameron places that openness beside crowded interiors. First class is filled with speech, but much of it conceals rather than reveals. People discuss status and proper behavior while avoiding the emotional truths directly before them. The lower decks are louder, yet their noise feels more honest because it comes from participation rather than performance. The film also gains force from what it chooses not to show. It cannot give every passenger a complete biography. Instead, it offers fragments, a glance held too long, a hand reaching for another, a family occupying a corner of the frame. We understand that every person contains a life larger than the film can hold. That incompleteness is part of the sorrow. A catastrophe also destroys countless stories no one will finish telling. Cameron suggests this through passing faces and interrupted routines. Even the ship is defined by omission. For much of the film, the danger remains outside the frame. The ice part is not made threatening through constant display. The ocean appears calm. The night seems empty. What cannot be seen becomes more frightening than what can. The absence of waves around the ice is especially important. There is no warning written across the surface. The sea withholds information. The lookouts stare into darkness, and the distance remains unreadable. Silence becomes environmental. Nature is not announcing an intention because nature has no intention to announce. Later, pauses become moral tests. People wait for instructions from systems they trust. Officers measure what can be done. Families look toward gates, staircases, and faces of authority. The delay between knowledge and action carries terrible weight. The camera holds on people realizing that official reassurance no longer matches the physical truth around them. That realization rarely needs a speech. A glance toward rising water can contain the collapse of an entire worldview. A person standing still while others rush can reveal shock more honestly than panic would. The film's restraint is strongest when it allows dignity to remain private. Some people respond to fear, to ritual, closeness, or calm. Cameron trusts posture and proximity. Two people lying beside one another, a parent remaining near a child, musicians exchanging looks before continuing. These images communicate decisions that words might make smaller. They also transform the blue once more. Blue no longer represents freedom. It has become the cold surrounding every human pocket of warmth. Yet the film does not let coldness define the people inside it. Their silence becomes care, a hand held without promise, a body staying close when no solution remains, presence offered when language has reached its limit. This is why the quiet images endure beside the spectacle. The large moments tell us what happened to the ship. The silent ones tell us what happened inside people. A camera can simply wait beside the face and allow us to recognize something the character may never say. Titanic uses that waiting to protect mystery. Rose is never reduced to a lesson about freedom. Jack is never explained into a psychological case. The passengers are never fully converted into symbols. The wreck remains partly inaccessible, hidden beneath darkness no floodlight can completely remove. What this film understands is that memory needs silence around it. Without silence, every image becomes information. With silence, an image can remain alive. The blue water at the beginning seems empty, but it is holding an entire world. The poses throughout the film work in the same way. They appear still, yet beneath them are fear, desire, resistance, tenderness, and everything language arrives too late to contain. Silence gives Titanic room to breathe, but the film does not always trust that room for long enough. Its greatest strength is emotional clarity. Its most noticeable weakness comes from the same instinct. James Cameron wants every conflict to be understood immediately, and sometimes that desire pushes complexity into the background. The film's world is vast, but several people within it are drawn with such bold lines that they function more as forces in Rose's journey than as complete human beings. Cal is the clearest example. Millie Zane gives him conviction, physical control, and flashes of wounded pride, yet the screenplay rarely allows those qualities to develop into genuine complexity. Tal represents ownership, status, and the violence beneath respectable power. That role is dramatically effective. You understand the danger he poses as soon as his affection begins to sound like entitlement. But because the film keeps intensifying his cruelty, he gradually loses some of the unsettling plausibility he has in the early scenes. A quieter version of Cal might have been more disturbing, a man who genuinely believes control is love, because society has rewarded that belief at every stage of his life. The film occasionally approaches that possibility, then pulls away toward more obvious villainy. This does not ruin the character. Melodrama often needs concentrated moral pressure. Kyle gives Rose something visible to resist, and his behavior ensures that the romance never becomes merely a conflict of taste. Still, each escalation reduces the ambiguity of Rose's choice. The more monstrous he becomes, the less difficult it is for us to understand why she rejects him. Ruth is more restrained and therefore more interesting, but she is also left at the edge of a deeper story. Her fear of losing social securities, her decisions a recognizable foundation. She is not protecting convention only because she enjoys it. She believes financial collapse will erase both her and her daughter. The screenplay tells us enough to recognize that fear, but not enough to explore the life that created it. Ruth enforces a system that has also trapped her, and the film might have found greater tragedy in that repetition. Instead, once Rose's liberation becomes central, Ruth is largely positioned as one more wall to cross. The lower deck characters face a related limitation. They give the film warmth, movement, and community, but many remain types rather than individuals. Their energy contrasts beautifully with the stiffness of first class, yet the contrast can romanticize hardship by making poverty appear naturally freer and more authentic. Jack's lack of money is real, but the story rarely asks what freedom without security costs him. His life before Rose remains intentionally light. That makes him effective as a force of possibility, though it also means Rose carries most of the relationship's psychological depth. Jack changes her profoundly. She does not alter him in quite the same visible way. The romance itself moves with fairy tale speed. This is partly the point. Limited time intensifies every decision, and the coming disaster gives their connection the urgency of a life compressed into days. Winslet and DiCaprio make that speed emotionally believable through chemistry and attention. Yet the screenplay occasionally substitutes certainty for development. Jack and Rose recognize one another quickly, and once that recognition occurs, relatively little internal conflict remains between them. Most resistance comes from the world outside the relationship. Their love is therefore powerful as escape, but less complicated as an ongoing meeting between two imperfect people. The dialogue can also become overly direct. Directors sometimes express the meaning of a scene when the image has already communicated it. Rose's confinement, Jack's freedom, and Cal's possessiveness are so clearly embedded in space and performance that verbal emphasis can feel unnecessary. This is where the film's confidence in visual storytelling occasionally clashes with its fear of being misunderstood. Cameron can create an image of a young girl being trained into upper-class behavior and let the entire future close around Rose without explanation. Elsewhere, the screenplay underlines emotions that were already visible. The problem is not sentiment. Sentiment is central to Titanic, and the film would lose its identity if it became embarrassed by feeling. The issue is repetition at moments when one gesture could have carried the weight alone. The present day expedition material also produces unevenness. Its purpose is essential. Without Old Rose, the film would lose its structure of memory and the contrast between recovered facts and lived experience. Gloria Stewart gives those scenes tenderness and gravity, but some of the expedition dialogue is broader and more comic than the surrounding reflection. The crew initially treats the wreck with an excitement that helps establish their emotional distance. Its tone can briefly make the famed story feel like a mechanism designed to deliver information. Once Rose begins her account, the film becomes so immersive that returning to the modern vessel can interrupt the emotional current. Pacing creates a similar challenge. The long first half is necessary because the ship must become a world before it can be lost. We need to understand its runes, divisions, rhythms, and illusions of safety. Without that investment, the disaster would be technically impressive but emotionally thin. Still, some passages of pursuit and obstruction during the later movement feel engineered to delay escape rather than deepen character. Locked doors, mistaken accusations, sudden separations, and repeated changes of direction increase urgency, but the accumulation can make the plot machinery visible. At moments, you sense the screenplay arranging one more obstacle because the characters cannot yet reach the final stage of the tragedy. The spectacle also risks overwhelming individuality. Cameron frequently corrects this by cutting from the ship's vast collapse to a small human reaction. But as the destruction intensifies, some passengers inevitably become elements in a visual composition. The film wants to honor the scale of loss, yet the scale that makes the catastrophe comprehensible can also create distance from particular lives. There is also a tension in the film's treatment of class. Titanic sharply observes how privilege governs access, credibility, and survival. Kate's lifeboat's uniforms and instructions all reveal that disaster does not erase hierarchy immediately, yet the moral arrangement can become too clean. The poor are often associated with vitality and loyalty, while the wealthy are frequently associated with arrogance, cowardice, or control. Several characters complicate that division, but the larger emotional design remains unmistakable. Class reality becomes easier to feel, though sometimes less difficult to think about. These flaws are not fatal wounds. Most are the marks of a film reaching for universality through directness. Titanic wants to be understood across languages, ages, and cultures. It uses recognizable emotional shapes because it is building a modern myth, not a quiet chamber drama. But directness has a cost. A myth can flatten the people who do not stand at its center. A villain can become a symbol. A romance can become so pure that its rougher human possibilities disappear. A spectacle can briefly turn suffering into pattern. The blue motif reveals the limitation most clearly. When the film allows blue to remain uncertain, it can mean memory, freedom, distance, cold, or death. When the screenplay explains too much, that uncertainty narrows. Titanic is strongest when it trusts an image to contain several feelings at once. Its weaknesses appear when it insists on choosing the feeling for us. That uncertainty is where the film's deepest meaning lies, because Titanic is not ultimately asking us to choose a single idea and carry it away. It is asking us to feel how several truths can occupy the same image. The ship is magnificent and doomed. The romance is brief and life-altering. Wealth creates beauty and cruelty at once. Memory preserves the past while changing it. The ocean offers freedom and annihilation. Nothing in the film's emotional world remains simple for long. At the center of all of this is Rose, and what she represents is larger than rebellion against one engagement. Her struggle is about the difference between having a life and possessing yourself within it. She has been given status, education, beauty, and access, yet none of those things guarantee agency. Her future has been prepared so completely that there is almost no room left for desire. The film understands that a life can appear privileged from the outside and still feel unlivable from within. Comfort can become another form of confinement, even if it comes attached to obedience. Rose's transformation, therefore, is not a movement from sadness into romance. It is a movement from being defined to becoming self defining. Jet matters because he recognizes that process before she fully trusts it. He does not create her inner life, he gives it space. The film is sometimes reduced to the idea that a young man saves a young woman, but Rose chooses repeatedly to step back from the edge, cross class boundaries, decide how she will be seen, and risk a future prepared for her. Jack becomes a witness to those choices. What this film understands is that being seen can order the direction of a life, not being admired, evaluated, or desired, but seen. Rose has spent years surrounded by people who perceive a function, daughter, fiancée, social asset, symbol of continuity. Jack looks at her and perceives movement. He notices what she might become. That is why the drawing matters beyond romance. It is an image made at a moment when Rose selects the terms of her own visibility. She removes the layers that identify her socially and keeps the necklace, an object loaded with another person's claim over her. Then she places that object inside an image that belongs to her own decision. The symbolism is simple but not empty. The necklace represents value assigned from outside. The drawing represents value discovered through attention. One is expensive because a market has decided it is. The other becomes priceless because memory has. The expedition believes the treasure is the jewel. Rose knows it is the self who once wore it and refused to remain owned. This is also why the framed story is about storytelling itself. The researchers know what happened to the ship in mechanical terms. They can describe impact, flooding, angle, and descent. But Rose's account reveals that facts alone cannot contain human experience. History often reaches us as numbers, passengers, lifeboats, survivors. Those numbers matter, but they create distance. Titanic answers by giving the catastrophe a face and asking what each person believed they were moving toward before loss intervened. The film is not claiming that one fictional romance explains the entire disaster. It uses intimacy as a doorway into scale. Once we care about one life, the surrounding lives become harder to treat as background. Class is the structure that connects those lives most brutally. Before the collision, hierarchy appears as etiquette and architecture. It decides why people eat, sleep, walk, and gather. After danger arrives, those same arrangements become questions of access. The film's deeper claim is that systems reveal a morality most clearly under pressure. A gate that appears ordinary during a voyage becomes terrifying when time is limited. A rule that seems procedural becomes a judgment about whose movement matters. A lifeboat becomes more than equipment, it becomes a measure of how power imagines human worth. Think about what that means. The disaster does not create inequality. It exposes the consequences of inequality already present. The iceberg is external, but the social catastrophe has been built into the ship from the beginning. That makes the Titanic more than a symbol of human arrogance. It is a symbol of confidence without humility. The ship represents the belief that technological achievement can make vulnerability irrelevant. Its elegance, speed, and scale encourage the people around it to mistake sophistication for safety. Cameron does not reject technology or ambition, he allows us to admire the ship. The tragedy lies between admiration and worship when people build something extraordinary and begin acting as though extraordinary things cannot fail. The same illusion appears in the social world above deck. Wealth is treated as permanence, reputation is treated as protection. Marriage is treated as a structure that can secure a family indefinitely. Rose's awakening and the ship's collision reveal the same truth at different scales. Systems that appear immovable can change in a moment. Blue carries that truth across the film. At first, blue is the color of what has survived beneath time. Then it becomes the horizon Rose imagines escaping toward. Later, it becomes exposure, cold, and the limit of the human body. The color never changes physically, yet our relationship to it does. That is how memory works. An image can return unchanged and mean something entirely different because the person looking at it has changed. The older Rose embodies this idea. She does not carry the past as a fixed record. She carries it as something that has continued developing inside her. The young woman on the ship is not sealed away in 1912. She remains present in every choice Rose made afterward. This is where the film separates survival from living. Survival is physical continuation. Living is what a person does with that continuation. Rose's story asks whether surviving tragedy is enough or whether survivor creates an obligation to become the person who nearly disappeared. The film's answer is emotional rather than philosophical. To live is to remain open to experience after loss. It is to refuse the identity fear prepared for you. It is to carry another person's influence without turning your own life into a memoria. That is a difficult balance. Memory can honor the dead, but it can also imprison the living. Titanic presents remembrance not as endless surrender to grief, but as a force that can support transformation. Rose does not preserve Jack by freezing herself beside the moment of loss. She preserves what he awakened by continuing. The romance, therefore, is not finally about duration. It is about consequence. Jack and Rose know each other for a short time, but time alone is a poor measurement of significance. Some relationships become important because they last. Others become important because they reveal a truth that cannot be unseen. The film asks us to accept that a brief encounter can divide a life into before and after. Its sentimentality speaks to the knowledge that not every formative relationship remains physically present. Someone can alter the shape of a future and then disappear from it. The person leaves, but the direction remains changed. Here's what I keep returning to. Titanic is less interested in whether love conquers death than in whether love can continue to produce life after death has taken something away. That is a more fragile idea and a more human one. The film also understands that freedom carries loss. Rose cannot become herself without leaving the identity that protected her materially. Liberation brings uncertainty, danger, and the collapse of structures once mistaken for safety. Freedom here is not merely doing whatever one wants, it is acting responsibility for one's own life. Jack's world appears spontaneous, but the lesson Rose carries is not to imitate his poverty or movement. It is to stop allowing fear to make every decision in advance. The ship gives that lesson urgency. Everyone is moving toward a destination, but few are present to the journey. The collision interrupts every plan and reduces life to immediate choices. Who do you help? What do you hold on to? Which rules still deserve obedience? What becomes meaningless when time contracts? The disaster strips away abstraction. Love, class, courage, responsibility, and fear become visible through action, and yet the film never suggests that crisis makes everyone equal. The water may be indifferent to class, but access to safety is not. Nature ignores hierarchy. Human systems preserve it for as long as they can. It still resonates because we inhabit structures that promise stability while distributing risk unevenly, confusing wealth with invulnerability and information with understanding. But Titanic does not leave us only with critique. Its emotional fate rests in the small forms of warmth people create when larger systems fail. A hand extended, a stranger believed, a musician continuing, a parent staying close, a person giving another person the courage to imagine a future. These gestures cannot stop the ocean or erase injustice. Human care matters precisely because it is not all powerful. The blue keeps expanding and still people make warmth inside it. That may be the film's most enduring thought. We do not control how long a moment lasts, how secure a structure remains, or when history will divide life into before and after. What we can sometimes control is whether another person feels unseen inside that moment. The Titanic sinks into history, but Rose rises out of the identity built for her. The two movements are inseparable. One world ends and another self begins. The film is really saying that survival becomes meaningful when it carries transformation, that memory becomes generous when it gives light back to the living, and that love is not measured only by what it keeps. Sometimes it is measured by what it releases. That release is the clue to James Cameron's signature. His films are filled with machines, weapons, vehicles, laboratories, and entire engineered worlds, but the machinery is rarely the final subject. It is the pressure surrounding a human choice. From the Terminator and Aliens to the Abyss, Terminator 2, Titanic, and the Avatar films, Cameron repeatedly builds systems that appear stronger than the people trapped inside them. A killing machine crosses time. A military unit enters an environment it misunderstands. An underwater facility becomes isolated under impossible pressure. A supposedly unsinkable ship moves into ice. A technologically dominant civilization assumes another world can be measured, occupied, and controlled. The surfaces change, but the dramatic question remains: what happens when confidence meets a force it cannot command? The BFI similarly connects Cameron's career to technological ambition, large-scale spectacle, and a recurring affinity for formidable female protagonists. Cameron loves competence. His characters often understand tools, procedures, and physical problems. They weld doors, operate vehicles, read instruments, and improvise under pressure. He does not treat technical knowledge as cold or dramatically uninteresting. In his cinema, knowing how something works can become a form of courage, but competence alone never saves the day. The people most certain of their control are often the ones who misunderstand the situation most completely. Institutions protect their plans, officers trust systems, corporations convert living words into resources, and powerful men assume possession is the same thing as understanding. Cameron's suspicion is not directed at technology itself. His films are too fascinated by machines for that. It is directed at technology joined to arrogance. Titanic may be the purest expression of that tension because the machine is beautiful, the ship is not introduced as an obvious monster. Cameron lets us admire its proportions, interiors, engines, and motion. Wonder is necessary. If the achievement meant nothing, its failure would mean less. This is characteristic of how he sees spectacle. He rarely asks us to stand outside the image and judge it calmly. He brings us close, lets us feel the seduction of scale, and then reveals the human cost hidden within it. The American Society of Cinematographers preserves Cameron's explanation that his approach to Titanic was to translate an event beyond ordinary human scale into human terms. That principle could describe much of his work. Enormity becomes legible through a face, a hand, a breath, or one person deciding not to abandon another. His female protagonists are central to this human scale. Sarah Connor, Ellen Ripley under Cameron's direction, Lindsay Brigman, Rose and Natalie are not interchangeable symbols of strength. Their power emerges through different relationships to fear, responsibility, violence, care, and survival. What connects them is that each is underestimated by a system that believes it is already defined her. Rose belongs unmistakably to this lineage, but she expands it. She is not a soldier, engineer, or warrior. Her first struggle is internal and social. She has to recognize that the identity imposed upon her is a kind of extinction. Her act of survival begins before the collision when she chooses to treat her own life as something more than an obligation to others. That makes Titanic both a continuation and a departure. It continues Cameron's fascination with enclosed environments, technical systems, catastrophe, and women discovering their capacity under pressure. But it turns those instincts toward melodrama and memory. The central battlefield is not a future wasteland or an alien colony. It is a dining room, a staircase, a corset, an engagement, and the quiet terror of seeing your entire future arranged without you. The romance also reviews another Cameron obsession: connection across apparently impassable boundaries, human and machine, civilian and soldier, one species and another, one social class and another. His stories often begin with categories that seem fixed, then create emotional force by making someone cross them. In Titanic, that crossing is mapped onto the ship itself. Rose descends, Jack ascends. They move through gates, corridors, decks, and rooms designed to keep their lives separate. Cameron makes love special. Intimacy becomes an act of trespassing against an architecture of hierarchy. Water too runs through his imagination as more than an environment. In the abyss, the depths contain danger, wonder, and contact with an intelligence human beings nearly fail to understand. In Titanic, the depths contain history. Water hides the evidence of origins, preserves fragments of human presence, and strips manufactured power down to rust. Cameron's deep-sea documentaries later extended his engagement with ocean exploration beyond fiction, including another encounter with the Titanic wreck in Coasts of the Abyss. The blue in this film therefore feels deeply connected to his artistic mind. It is scientific and spiritual at once. It invites exploration but punishes certainty. It can hold a mission, a memory, or an entire lost civilization beyond ordinary reach. Cameron is sometimes described mainly as an engineer of spectacle, and the description is not wrong. Few filmmakers are as interested in how a large cinematic mechanism functions, but Titanic reveals why he builds those mechanisms. He wants pressure great enough to remove titans when the walls fail. Who are you? When the institution no longer protects you, what do you protect? When technology reaches limit, what form of human connection remains? His answers are emotionally direct. Courage is action, love is sacrifice. Arrogance isolates, survival creates responsibility. These ideas can seem simple, yet Cameron gives them weight by placing bodies inside environments where every choice has a physical consequence. Titanic is not a deviation from his career because it is romantic. It may be the film in which his romanticism becomes impossible to miss. The machines, water, scale, and danger were always carrying a belief that people reveal their deepest nature when they choose what matters more than survival. The ship is his perfect image, an astonishing human creation divided by power, moving beautifully through darkness, and unable to understand the blue world beneath it until that world enters the hull. Once you know where the ship is going, almost every image begins to carry two times at once. On a first viewing, the early movement of Titanic is shaped by discovery. You are learning the ship, the glass system, the relationships, and the emotional distance between Rose and the life arranged for her. On a rewatch, discovery gives way to recognition. The details are no longer simply introducing a world, they are quietly saying goodbye to it. The departure becomes especially difficult to watch. Passengers wave from the decks with the casual confidence of people beginning an ordinary journey. Families organize luggage, workers complete procedures. The ship pulls away beneath clear daylight, and the atmosphere is full of beginnings. But memory has already placed blue water beneath every golden image. You notice how often the film frames the Titanic as a complete object before gradually breaking it into rooms, corridors, and private lives. Those early wide shots first communicate scale and wonder. On rewatch, they also communicate vulnerability. The vessel appears enormous, yet the ocean surrounding it is larger. The camera seems to know this even when the people on deck do not. Small comments about speed, ice, construction, and confidence also acquire different pressure. The characters hear professional information or casual conversation. You hear a countdown that no one has recognized. The film does not hide its destination, but it scatters reminders of it through scenes devoted to other things. That creates an unusual form of suspense. You are not waiting to discover what will happen. You are waiting for the characters to enter the knowledge you already possess. Rose's early despair changes most dramatically on rewatch. At first, the moment at the stern establishes the depth of her confinement and creates the circumstances of her meeting with Jack. Later, it feels connected to the entire field's meditation on survival. She begins the story believing that disappearance may be the only choice she owns. By the end, survival becomes an act she must repeatedly choose. The distance between those two versions of Rose is the film's true journey. Her first encounter with Jack therefore carries more weight the second time. His effort to bring her back from the edge is not simply the beginning of a romance. It anticipates the promise that will later define her future. He asks her to remain in the world before either of them understands how urgently that request will return. The film places this pattern everywhere. Early gestures become rehearsals for later decisions. Jack encourages Rose to trust her balance at the bow. Later, physical balance becomes a matter of survival as the ship's orientation changes. Their playful running through corridors becomes a desperate navigation of the same spaces. Doors that once offered privacy later become traps. Staircases, first associated with status and romance, become measurements of rising water. Even the drawing transforms. On a first viewing, it marks intimacy, trust, and Rose's rejection of Carl's ownership. On rewatch, it becomes one of the few physical traces capable of crossing the disaster and reaching the future. Jack's art preserves a self Rose had only just begun to recognize. The page survives as evidence not merely that she was there, but that she briefly stood outside the identity imposed on her. The necklace develops a similar double meaning. It appears to be the object driving the modern expedition and a symbol of Kyle's wealth in the past. Knowing its final place in Rose's life reveals how completely she has changed its value. To the expedition, it is treasure because it can be recovered. To Carl, it is treasure because it can be owned. To Rose, it becomes meaningful because it carries a memory no market can interpret. The rewatch also complicates Jack. Because his fate is known, his ease acquires fragility. His confidence no longer feels unlimited. Every plan he imagines with Rose belongs to a future we know he will never enter, yet the performance does not become only sad. Jack remains alive in each moment because DiCaprio plays him without the awareness of tragedy. This protects the character from becoming a ghost too early. The sorrow comes from the distance between his openness and our knowledge. Carl and Ruth also become more revealing. Their early insistence on control looks less stable when you know how quickly the physical structure supporting that control will fail. Their confidence depends on rooms, money, servants, reputation, and rules. The disaster does not merely endanger them, it exposes how much of their authority required a functioning world around them. The film's background characters become easier to notice as well. Once curiosity about the central plot has faded, your attention moves toward faces at tables, workers in mechanical spaces, crew members receiving instructions, families passing through hallways, and passengers standing at the edges of compositions. They were always there, but foreknowledge makes their presence heavier. You understand that each person is approaching a private confrontation with fear, separation, or impossible choice. The ship's sounds also change. The steady engines initially communicate power and progress. On rewatch, they sound like momentum without awareness. The mechanical pulse beneath the romance reminds you that the vessel continues forward regardless of personal transformation. Rose may choose another life, Jack may imagine a future with her. The machinery does not pause to recognize either evolution. James Horner's themes gain similar depth. Music associated with freedom already contains mourning because you know freedom will be purchased through loss. The melody does not need to change. Memory changes the way you hear it. That is the central experience of rewatching Titanic. The film becomes less about surprise and more about emotional simultaneity. Beauty and destruction occupy the same frame. Hope and grief rise through the same music. A beginning is already an ending, but the ending does not erase the truth of the beginning. Some of the broader dialogue and more mechanical plot obstacles may become more visible after repeated viewings. Once suspense weakens, the screenplay's construction can occasionally feel exposed. Yet the emotional design grows stronger because its motifs were never dependent on surprise alone. The blue reveals this most clearly. At first, it seems to wait at the end of the story as cold and death. On rewatch, it is present from the opening second. It surrounds the deck, waits beyond the bright windows, stretches beneath the lovers at the bow, and slowly changes meaning as Rose changes. The film gains power because you no longer watch only to learn whether these people survive. You watch to understand what they manage to give one another before survival becomes the only question left. Memory has told you where the voyage ends. It also teaches you to look more carefully at everything that existed before the ending arrived. That ocean was already crowded with cinematic memory before Cameron's ship entered it. The Titanic disaster began generating images almost immediately after 1912. Newsreel material, commemorative work, songs, books, and later dramatic films transformed the sinking from a historical event into a modern myth. By 1997, Cameron was not approaching an untouched story. He was entering a conversation that had already spent decades asking how cinema should represent a catastrophe whose scale resists any single point of view. The Library of Congress records a long cultural afterlife surrounding the disaster, including early footage and multiple earlier screen treatments. Among those films, Roy Ward Baker's A Night to Remember, released in 1958 and adapted from Mortal Lord's book, stands closest to Cameron's achievement. It approaches the sinking with the directness of historical reconstruction. following officers, passengers, crew members, and class divisions as the disaster develops. Its attention is distributed across the ship rather than concentrated primarily within one invented romance. Trittian describes it as shaped by British fact-based filmmaking traditions, while the BFI continues to regard it as an unusually careful screen depiction of the event. You can feel its presence in Cameron's film. The gradual disbelief after the collision, the contrast between calm procedure and approaching danger, the musicians continuing as order dissolves, the separation of classes, and the terrible physical transformation of the decks all belong to a visual inheritance Cameron did not invent. The BFI has noted the strong resemblance between the two films, even while emphasizing how Cameron's scale seemed capable of overwhelming everything that came before. But resemblance is not repetition. A Night to Remember moves outward across an ensemble. Cameron moves inward through rows. The earlier film asks how a civilization of passengers and crew responded when certainty failed. The later film asks how that failure was experienced, remembered, and transformed within one consciousness. This difference changes the emotional architecture. In the 1950 film, the disaster itself organizes the narrative. Human stories gather around it, and the film's sober power comes from the accumulation of responses. In Cameron's version, the ship first becomes the site of a personal awakening. The collision does not begin Rose's crisis. It interrupts a crisis that has already led her toward the edge. The historical catastrophe and the invented romance therefore move toward each other from opposite directions. One is known by the world, the other exists privately between two people. When they meet, history gains intimacy, and intimacy gains irreversible scale. Earlier cinema had also treated the ship as a setting for fictional melodrama. The 1953 film Titanic, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb, placed a troubled upper-class family aboard the liner, using the voyage to intensify domestic and social conflict. The story of Margaret Brown had likewise entered popular cinema through the 1964 musical The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Cameron inherited not only a tradition of reconstruction, but a tradition of using the Titanic as a stage on which class, marriage, identity, and survival could become emotionally concentrated. What he adds is a fusion of those traditions at blockbuster scale. His film has the crowd movement and residual urgency of disaster cinema, the heightened emotional structure of melodrama, the class-crossing desire of classical romance, and the investigative frame of a modern archaeological mystery. Instead of choosing between historical reconstruction and invented intimacy, it makes each support the other. This fusion explains why Titanic can move from a boiler room to a ballroom, from deep-sea machinery to an elderly woman's face, without feeling as though it has abandoned its central subject. Every boot is our limit if that's the question. Want certain, where that weaved uncertainty disappears. The film also belongs to the tradition of epic romance, where personal feeling is placed against landscapes and historical forces too large for the lovers to control. In such stories, the romance becomes moving partly because it cannot seal itself off from time. Private desire is exposed to war, class, geography, or catastrophe. Cameron embraces that scale without surrendering the directness of popular melodrama. He does not ask whether Jack and Rose's emotions are modest enough to appear realistic beside history. He allows their love to be enormous because the disaster is enormous. The emotional and physical scales rise together, yet Rose changes the tradition from within. She is not simply remembering a lost lover. She is narrating the creation of herself. The past is filtered through a woman whose public identity was almost completed for her before she found the language to resist it. The voyage becomes not only the story of whom she loved, but the story of whose name, future, and memory she chose to carry. That subjective frame gives Cameron's films something earlier, more procedural accounts were not designed to pursue. The wreck is both historical evidence and psychological landscape. Its rooms exist on the ocean floor, but they also exist inside Rose. The camera's journey through broken metal becomes a journey toward a hidden life. Technology makes this movement possible at a new level of immersion. Earlier films could reconstruct the event through models, sets, editing, and carefully organized crowds. Cameron inherited those physical methods and combined them with late 20th century digital effects, allowing the camera to travel around the ship with a freedom that turned historical scale into apparent lived space. The result was recognized as a major cinematic event built from both practical and visual effects craft. But the true transformation is not technological, it is emotional. Cameron takes the dignity and procedural tension of earlier Titanic cinema, then fills the structure with the heat of a coming of age romance. It takes a disaster remembered through public history and lets it pass through private memory. He turns the ship from the subject of the film into the world through which Rose must travel to claim her life. The cinema before Titanic gave Cameron the ship, the social divisions, the accumulating dread, and the image of human order tilting toward darkness. What his film adds is the blue. Not simply the blue of the Atlantic, but the blue of memory looking backward, the color that allows a historical object, a cinematic inheritance, and one woman's unfinished self to occupy the same depth. And now that we have followed that color through the cinema that came before, we are ready to enter the place where every earlier meaning returns at once, the collision, the sinking, the final choices, and the ending that transforms survival into a lifetime. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here. Go experience it first and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The collision itself is almost quiet. That is the first cruelty. After so much confidence, the Titanic does not meet the iceberg with the explosive violence a conventional disaster film might prepare us for. The ship turns, ice scrapes along the hull, fragments fall across the deck, and some passengers treat them like souvenirs. Above the waterline, the damage appears almost trivial. Below, the truth is already irreversible. Water enters through a sequence of openings, moving from one compartment to the next. The ship does not understand what has happened, but its design does. The calculations arrive before the panic. Thomas Sandus studies the damage and recognizes that the Titanic is no longer a vessel traveling toward New York. It has become a structure measuring the time remaining inside it. This is where the film's blue motif completes its invasion. Until now, blue has remained outside the warm interiors. It surrounded the wreck, stretched across the horizon, and waited beyond the windows. After the collision, it crosses the boundary. Water enters boiler rooms and lower corridors first, reaching the workers and third-class passengers before many people above are aware that anything serious has happened. The social meaning is immediate. Those nearest the machinery encounter reality first, while those protected by luxury remain insulated by distance, information, and disbelief. The disaster rises physically through the ship in the same direction that privilege has always looked down. Jack and Rose initially return to the social conflict that shaped the romance. Carl has used the necklace to frame Jack as a thief, and Jack is restrained below deck. The accusation is not only a plot device, it is the system attempting to restore its original order. Rose has crossed a boundary. So Carl uses wealth, authority, and credibility to place Jack back where society believes he belongs. But the ship is beginning to destroy the conditions that made that authority stable. Rose is placed in a lifeboat and offered safety within the same structure she has spent the film escaping. Her mother remains concerned with class boundaries even as the entire meaning of class is being exposed as fragile. Carl treats survival as another transaction. The boat represents life, but accepting it on their terms would also mean returning to the identity Rose has rejected. She steps away. This is one of her most important decisions, because Jack is not beside her when she makes it. She chooses to search for him despite the pressure of her mother, her fiancé, the officers, and the physical danger around her. Earlier, Jack gave her reason to believe another life was possible. Now, Rose acts from that belief independently. Her return below deck reverses the movement of her earlier liberation. Before, she descended into the lower spaces to dance and discover warmth. Now she descends into darkness and rising water. The route once associated with freedom has become dangerous, but she follows it because freedom has acquired responsibility. Jack is handcuffed to a pipe as water clangs around him. The image reduces their struggle to time, metal, and the movement of blue across a room. Rose searches for help and finds that the systems around her are already failing. Corridors are emptying. Crew members are overwhelmed. Rose no longer produces solutions. She must improvise. Her attempt to free Jack is frightening because the film allows her uncertainty to remain visible. She is not transformed into an effortless action hero. She is terrified, inexperienced, and aware that failure may harm the person she is trying to save. Courage is not shown as the absence of fear, it is action taken while fear remains. When she succeeds, their union does not restore safety. It only allows them to move together through a world shrinking around them. Water turns familiar spaces into traps. Doors resist. Corridors redirect them. Gates that previously expressed social separation become immediate threats to life. The film makes class architecture reveal its final meaning. Boundaries created for order can become instruments of abandonment when danger arrives. Third class passengers are not merely farther from the lifeboats, they are delayed by a system accustomed to controlling their movement. The disaster exposes how bureaucracy can become violence without anyone needing to announce a violent intention. Jack and Rose struggle upward while the water follows. Their movement is no longer romantic trespass, it is survival against the ship's vertical design. Above deck, lifeboats are lowered without using their full capacity. Fear, procedure, and disbelief combine into waste. Some officers are reluctant to fill the boat completely because they worry about the lowering mechanisms. Some passengers hesitate because the ship still appears safer than the small boats hanging over darkness. The tragedy is not simply that there were too few places, it is also that people could not emotionally accept the truth quickly enough to use what was available. The Titanic has trained everyone to believe in it. Its size becomes a form of persuasion. Deck beneath their feet feels solid, the lights remain on, the music continues. Safety appears to be the larger object even when the larger object is sinking. Carl's response to the crisis reveals the emptiness beneath his certainty. He tries wealth, influence, deception, and finally violence. Every method depends on the assumption that his survival should take priority. When one form of control fails, he reaches for another. His pursuit of Jack and Rose through the flooding ship is one of the film's broadest melodramatic turns, and it risks reducing the disaster to a personal chase. Yet, symbolically, it is consistent. Cole would rather endanger Rose than accept that she has become unreachable to him. Possession remains more important than love even when the world is collapsing. Rose and Jack escape him, but escape itself keeps changing, meaning there is no stable destination left inside the ship. A staircase leads upward until water cleans it. A deck offers air until its angle becomes impossible. The Titanic's architecture, once designed to guide movement elegantly, loses all certainty. The grand staircase receives the ocean like an invasion of another world. Water breaks through the doors and sweeps across a space built to display permanence. Wood, glass, decoration, and status become debris in seconds. Blue consumes gold. That visual transformation is the film's entire argument, compressed into one image. Human beings created a magnificent interior and believed it separated them from nature, time, and vulnerability. The water does not destroy its beauty because beauty was meaningless. It destroys it because beauty was never protection. Around the central characters, the film begins gathering its smaller human endings. The musicians continue playing, not because music can alter the outcome, but because it can preserve dignity and connection while order disappears. Their performance becomes a final structure, freely chosen after the ship's imposed structures have failed. An elderly couple lies together rather than facing separation. A mother remains close to her children and offers comfort through story. Thomas Andrews stands near the room he helped create, confronting the failure of an achievement that had defined him. Captain Smith withdraws into the wheelhouse as the sea reaches the place from which the ship was once commanded. These moments are brief because no single film can hold the full reality of so many lives. The restraint gives them weight. The film does not need to explain what each person is thinking. A gesture becomes the remaining language. Rose and Jack move toward the stern, returning to the place where they first met. The repetition is precise. Earlier Rose stood above dark water and considered letting go. Jack persuaded her to return to life. Now they stand above the same ocean because the ship itself is disappearing beneath them. The location is unchanged. The people are not. The Titanic breaks apart under forces its designers never imagined it would face. The lights fail, and the artificial warmth that defined the ship vanishes. For a moment, darkness replaces the visual order of the film. Then the stern rises, turning the deck into a vertical surface. People cling to railings that were never designed to support them in this way. Architecture loses its intended meaning. Floors become walls, open decks become cliffs. The ship is no longer a word. It is an object surrendering to gravity. When the final section descends, the film follows it into the blue. The ocean closes over the Titanic, and the enormous spectacle suddenly becomes intimate. Hundreds of people are left in freezing water, calling into darkness. The scale of the disaster is heard as separate human voices. Then those voices begin to disappear. The film handles the cold with restraint but not distance. It shows the physical limits of survival without turning suffering into spectacle. The water is terrifying because it does not need motion. Its stillness drains life. Jack finds a floating piece of wreckage and helps Rose onto it. The film has generated years of argument about the object's fate, but that literal debate can distract from the dramatic meaning. The final movement is not designed as an engineering puzzle. It is about Jack using what remains of his strength to keep Rose connected to the promise of life. He stays in the water while she remains a bulwark, or defends opposition's meteor. Warmth and blue, presence and memory, sacrifice and survival, the body that cannot continue, and the life that must. Jack asks Rose to hold on to the future rather than surrender to the cold. He frames survival not merely as remaining alive through the night, but as continuing into experiences she cannot yet see. His faith in her future becomes the last gift he can provide. Rose listens as the cold makes response increasingly difficult. When rescue finally approaches, she tries to wake him. The realization comes slowly. There is no dramatic reversal, no hidden escape, and no final miracle. Jack has become still. The film allows Rose to grieve, then confronts her with the choice that has defined her entire journey. She can remain beside him and disappear, or she can act on the life he believed she could live. Her promise becomes action. She releases Jack into the blue and searches for a way to make herself heard. Her voice is weak, so she takes a whistle from a nearby officer and uses it to call the returning boat. Survival depends on transforming an object associated with authority into an instrument of her own will. She is pulled from the water and taken aboard the rescue ship. Around her are survivors wrapped against the cold, each carrying an absence that cannot yet be measured. Carl searches among them, still looking for Rose as though possession might be restored after everything. She sees him and chooses silence. Earlier, silence was the space in which her identity survived beneath social control. Now silence becomes severance. She refuses to return his gaze and allows the old life to believe she is gone. When asked for her name after reaching New York, she gives herself Jack's surname. The gesture is not a surrender of identity to him. It is the first time she names herself outside the system that defined her. She chooses a name connected to the person who saw her becoming, then builds a life that extends far beyond the days they shared. The film later reveals that Rose fulfilled the possibilities Jack described. Photographs showed travel, adventure, independence, family, and movement. She did not remain emotionally frozen beside the Titanic, she carried the encounter forward. In the present, the expedition has finally understood that the object they were seeking cannot explain the story. The necklace has been with Rose all along. She walks alone to the stern of the research vessel and holds it above the same blue water. Then she lets it fall. The jewel descends toward the wreck, turning slowly through darkness. What Carl treated as possession and the expedition treated as discovery turns to the ocean without becoming anyone's prize. Rose's ad completes the motif. At the beginning, people send machines downward to extract value from the past. At the end, Rose sends value back into the depths because its meaning belongs to memory, not ownership. There is no post-credit scene. The emotional conclusion arrives before the credits in the final return to the ship. Rose appears to sleep, though the film leaves room to interpret the transition as dream, memory, or death at the end of a completed life. The camera moves through the restored Titanic. The wreck becomes warm again. Corroded surfaces regain their shape. The staircase returns in gold, filled with those lost in the sinking. Jack waits at its center. Rose joins him, and the gathered figures respond as though a separation lasting a lifetime has finally closed. The image is sentimental, but it is earned by the film's structure. We began by entering the ship as a grave. We end by entering it as memory released from decay. The blue does not disappear. It remains outside, holding the wreck and everything history cannot restore. But inside Rose's final vision, warmth survives. The Titanic sank. Jack died. Rose lived. And the film's final meaning rests in the distance between those three truths. Survival could not undo loss. Love could not stop death. Memory could not rebuild the actual ship. Yet one person carried the warmth of a brief encounter across an entire lifetime. Until the blow that once threatened to erase her became the place where she finally returned what she no longer needed to hold. The moment that remains is not the ship breaking beneath the night, or the staircase filling with water, or even Jack waiting beneath the clock in Rose's final vision. It is the moment Rose lets him go. She is alone on the floating wreckage, surrounded by a darkness so wide that the remaining voices seem to have been swallowed by it. Jack's hand is still in hers, but warmth has left it. Rescue has passed once already. The cord is closing around her thoughts. Every part of the image seems to invite surrender. Rose speaks the promise she made, separates their hands, and watches him descend into the blue. What stays with me is the quietness of that movement. The film has spent so much time making Jack vivid: his speed, his laughter, his curiosity, his refusal to move through the world cautiously. Then he disappears without spectacle. The water accepts him almost gently. There is no final burst of music large enough to reverse what has happened. There is only Rose, the promise, and the terrible space his body leaves behind. For a moment, grief and surrender appear to be the same thing. Then Rose hears the whistle of a returning lifeboat. She tries to call out, but her voice is too weak. The film could have allowed rescue to arrive through chance. Instead, it makes survival depend on one more decision. Rose must move away from Jack, leave the fragile platform, enter the water again, and take the whistle from the officer floating nearby. That movement is physically small. Emotionally, it contains the whole film. At the beginning, Rose approaches the ocean because she believes ending her life may be the only choice still under her control. Jack interrupts that decision and helps her imagine another future. At the end, she is once again beside the dark water, once again standing at the edge between disappearance and life. But Jack can no longer pull her back. She must become the person who pulls herself back. That is why the whistle matters to me more than any grand romantic gesture. It is a thin sound against an enormous night, but it is enough. Rose does not defeat the ocean. She does not undo the disaster or recover what has been lost. She simply insists that she is still there. The sound is survivor becoming audible. There is something honest in the fact that choosing life does not look triumphant. Rose is exhausted. She has just released the person who gave that choice meaning. Survival is not presented as victory over grief. It is presented as carrying grief into the next moment because another moment remains possible. That understanding gives the ending its emotional strength. Rose does not honor Jack by remaining forever beside the place where he died. She honors him by living beyond it. The photographs near her bed reveal a life full of movement, risk, family, work, and experience. They show that the promise was not preserved as a sentence, it became behavior. Here is what I keep returning to. Jack's greatest act is not that he dies for Rose. It is that he helps her imagine a life so fully that, after losing him, she can still choose it. And Rose's greatest act is not merely surviving the water. It is refusing to make survival the end of her story. That is what separates Titanic from a romance built only around loss. The film grieves deeply, but it does not worship grief. It allows love to remain meaningful without requiring the living person to stop moving. Jack becomes part of Rose's life, not because she spends every year looking backward, but because the courage she recognized in her continues to shape the way she moves forward. Would I return to this film? Yes, though not because the experience becomes easier. Rewatching it means entering a world whose destruction is visible beneath every beautiful surface. The golden rooms already contain blue water. The music of possibility already carries mourning. Every moment of freedom is shadowed by the knowledge that time is closing. But returning also reveals how alive the film is before tragedy claims it. The dancing below deck, the wind at the bow, the concentration of the drawing, the movement through corridors, and Rose's gradual recognition of herself all gain value because they are temporary. The film does not ask us to deny that temporary things end. It asks us to stop using their ending as proof that they did not matter. That idea reaches beyond romance. A conversation can change a decision, a gesture can restore someone's sense of dignity, a brief period of courage can redirect decades. We rarely know which moment another person will carry or how far its effect will travel after we are gone. The person who will carry Titanic most deeply is not simply someone who loves tragic romance or historical spectacle. It is someone who understands the fear of living a life designed by other people. Someone who has felt the distance between appearing safe and feeling trapped. Someone who knows that being truly seen can be both comforting and frightening because recognition creates responsibility. Once you see the person you might become, returning to disappearance becomes harder. The film will also remain with anyone who has had to continue after a loss that seemed to divide time itself. It does not pretend continuation erases absence. The blue remains, the wreck remains, Jack remains unreachable within history. But Rose's life proves that memory can be carried without becoming an anchor. When she releases his hand, she is not releasing what he meant. She is releasing the belief that love must pull her beneath the surface in order to remain true. Then she enters the freezing water, finds the whistle, and sends one small human sound across the darkness. The boat turns back, and a life that nearly ended before the voyage began finally moves toward everything it was not yet able to see. In the end, Titanic is an enormous film built around a very small human need. The need to know that our life belongs to us before time carries it beyond our reach. Its scale is almost impossible to separate from its identity. The ship, the crowds, the machinery, the ocean, and the physical destruction give the film the grandeur of legend. Yet none of that explains why it still hurts. The spectacle becomes meaningful because James Cameron keeps returning to faces, a young woman watching her future close around her, a young man recognizing the fear she cannot yet explain, families realizing that the rules they trusted will not protect them equally, two hands holding each other while the blue grows colder. The film is sincere in a way that modern cinema often hesitates to be. It wants wonder to feel enormous. It wants love to feel transformative. It wants grief to reach you without disguising itself as irony. That openness can sometimes become too direct. Several characters are drawn more as emotional forces than complete people. Some dialogue explains what the images have already made clear, and the later obstacles occasionally reveal the machinery of the screenplay. But those limitations do not erase what the film accomplishes. Titanic creates a world you can physically understand. You know where privilege lives, where labor happens, where warmth gathers, and where people are prevented from moving. The ship's architecture becomes social order, then becomes danger. Gold becomes blue, open space becomes exposure. A vessel introduced as certainty becomes evidence that no human structure is beyond failure. At its center, Kate Winslet gives the spectacle a soul. Rose's awakening is not convincing because she delivers a perfect argument for freedom. It is convincing because you watch her learn what freedom feels like before she knows how to sustain it. Leonardo DiCaprio gives Jack the lightness that makes that awakening possible. He does not offer her a complete life, he offers her the courage to imagine one. That distinction is why the romance survives its simplicity. Jack is not the destination of Rose's journey. He is the person who helps her understand that a destination can be chosen. The film will be loved most deeply by people who surrender to emotion without needing every feeling to be understated. It will speak to anyone who values classical romance, historical spectacle, production design, visual storytelling, and films that treat popular entertainment as a space for genuine sorrow. It may connect less strongly with people who prefer quieter characterization, morally ambiguous conflicts, or romance developed across a longer and more psychological, logical, complex period. Its villains are broad, its symbolism is clear, its music tells you when the emotional tide is rising. Titanic does not hide the machinery of melodrama because it believes the machinery can still carry truth, and often it does. This is a film made for the cinema. Its scale needs a screen large enough to make the ship feel like a world and sound powerful enough to make its engines, music, breaking metal, and final silence move through the body. Streaming can preserve the story, but a theater restores the physical imbalance between you and the image. The ship should appear too large to hold in one glance. It is also something worth owning, not merely because it rewards rewatching, but because its meaning changes as your relationship with memory changes. When you are younger, the romance may dominate. Later, Rose's survival may feel more important. Later still, the elderly Rose may become the film's true center. A person who carried one brief encounter across a full and self-directed life. My personal rating is 8 out of 10. It earns that rating because despite its broadness and occasional excess, it transforms technical ambition into an intimate reminder that surviving is only the beginning of choosing how to live. The necklace returns to the ocean. The wreck remains beneath the darkness. The people who once filled its rooms are beyond the reach of every machine searching for them. But somewhere above that blue, a woman kept her promise by becoming more alive than the world had ever permitted her to imagine. Thank you for spending this time with me and for allowing a film this familiar to become strange, intimate, and moving again. That is what I hope we can continue doing here at the Cineflux. Not simply revisiting famous movies, but looking beneath the images we think we already understand. Because sometimes the films that have become part of popular culture are the ones we have stopped seeing clearly. Their scenes become symbols, their music becomes memory, and their emotions become so familiar that we forget how carefully they were created. If this journey through Titanic gave you a new way to see the film, you can support the Cineflux by liking the video and subscribing. More importantly, share your experience in the comments. What does the blue of Titanic mean to you? Freedom, memory, grief, or something else entirely? Do you believe Rose's final vision is a dream, a memory, or her return to the people preserved inside the ship? And which moment stays with you after the spectacle has faded? There is no single correct answer. Films survive because different people carry different pieces of them, and the conversation between those pieces keeps the work alive. Until then, remember that the most important treasures in cinema are really the objects people search for. They are the moments that change meaning as we change, waiting beneath the surface until we are ready to see them again. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.